Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Dan Malthrop. I'm the chief executive here. And as we get started, I just want to say, you guys look great. Thank you for coming today. It is great to see all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Just a small, that was like a golf clap. Thank you. That's better. Appreciate it. So a few years ago in 2017, when author Richard Rothstein appeared on our stage here at the City Club for his book, The Color of Law, he argued with exacting precision how segregation in America, the incessant kind that continues to dog our major cities and has contributed to so much social strife, especially in recent years. He argued that this is the byproduct of explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal levels. The Color of Law brilliantly recounted how government segregated our communities, intentionally causing and creating divisions based on race. And while many had argued for decades that racial divisions in our cities were the product of de facto segregation, just choices people made, Rothstein marshaled evidence arguing that segregation was in fact de jure. It was the product of law, product of policy. But the book left the reader with a big question. What's to be done about it? It was a question that gnawed at Rothstein, perhaps because his daughter raised it first, so much that he joined forces with their daughter, Leah Rothstein, who joins us today, to find answers. And the result is the book we're here to discuss today. That book is called Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. And I want to note, too, that Leah Rothstein joins a special group of people, women, whose fathers also spoke at the City Club years ago. So Bobby Kennedy spoke here in 1968, and Kerry Kennedy followed him more recently. Dick Cheney spoke at the City Club, and many of you may have been in the room when Liz Cheney spoke a couple of years ago. And now the Cheneys are thinking, wow, we're in league with the Rothsteins. It's pretty cool. Leah Rothstein's policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer and a labor organizer, much of this work in Oakland, California, working on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. She has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government, and she's been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy, practice, and finance. Moderating our conversation is a great friend of the City Club of Cleveland, Evelyn Burnett, co-founder and CEO at Third Space Action Lab. If you have any questions for Leah Rothstein, you can text them to 330-541-5794. The number again is 330-541-5794, and the staff will work it into the second half of the program. Members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Leah Rothstein and Evelyn Burnett.
Thank you. So excited to be on the City Club stage again with you, someone who's, I like to think that I had the book first and read it first. But folks that know Third Space and know me know that we always start every conversation with a soul check. Dan said, don't take a long time, Evelyn, so this is gonna be quick.
Okay.
What's your soul soother and booster? Like what's the thing that's giving you energy, and what's the thing that's keeping you calm and collected in your soul? And then just also wanted to know, like, who are you? Where are you from? What inspires you and inspires your work?
And you want me to do all of that quickly?
Dan said quickly.
Okay. All right, I'll try to be quick about it. And I think I'll answer by telling a story.
Please.
From a couple nights ago, I was walking down the street here, just a couple blocks away. And I was walking alone, and a man walked towards me, older African-American man, had a shuffle, he was limping. And I looked up and I said, hello. He said, hello. We passed each other, and then he stopped and turned around and said, hey, I just want to thank you. And I said, for what? And he said, for looking at me. And I was like, well, of course. And he said, well, most people just look down. And they don't look at me or say hello. And he told me to thank my parents for raising me right.
Shout out to the parents.
And I think that's both what soothes my soul and what keeps me going is this, I mean, it makes me really sad and really angry that we don't acknowledge each other's humanity, not only sort of at the policy level, but at the individual level walking down the street. And so that's what fires me up, and it soothes me that we can make a difference that way. Like looking in someone's eyes made a difference for him and for me. I did that shortly, succinctly.
That was good. That was strong. I want to stay there for a minute though, because you mentioned your parents. Like, who are your parents? Where are you from?
We all know about my dad. Both of my parents are lifelong activists. I grew up in California. We moved around a lot when I was younger because my dad was a union organizer at the time. Both of them were very involved in the civil rights movement, in the labor movement, in the anti-Vietnam War movement. You know, I grew up in a family where it was normal and sort of understood to be our responsibility to be active members of our community and society. You know, as a family, we sort of understand what it's like to be persecuted and othered, and also understand what it means when we remain silent about others' persecution. And so it's just sort of been in my blood and the DNA of my family. And sort of like more embarrassingly is I grew up thinking that when I came to be in college, I would like magically have a massive social movement to join to like change the world. Because, you know, I heard about that's what my parents did in college. And, you know, it took me a little while to learn that that's not how it works. You have to build that movement. So it's just sort of been part of my DNA and how I understand my role in community and in society, and sort of my safety comes from ensuring other people's safety and humanity also.
Thank you for sharing that. And shout out to union organizer parents. Mine are in the back. So you talked about the role of being active. So I want to pivot and kind of ground for folks that haven't had an opportunity to read the book yet about the title. So Just Action, you could think of justice in action. What were you signaling about the types of remedies needed to address the legacy and persistence of racial and residential segregation?
Yeah, well, as you noted, the title Just Action has two meanings. And one is that the action we need to redress segregation needs to be just. You know, we need to ensure that it's doing the thing we want it to do, which is redressing and remedying race-specific harms. So we want our actions to sort of bring justice to those past harms. And we just need action. Like, it's not that complicated, it's not that difficult, we just need to start acting to do that.
For folks that struggle with that, and I learned this, we had the privilege of having Leah at the Third Space Reading Room just the other night, and you were talking about your parents. I imagine some folks might say like, well, you know, you come from this lineage and sort of legacy, but I'm just I hear this a lot in our work, I'm just a regular person. What do you say to those folks?
I mean, we're all just regular people.
That's right.
And I came from this legacy, but I still had to learn how to do this and overcome. You know, it's scary to start to talk to people who don't look like you, or talk about issues that are controversial in your community, and start to like have a bigger voice. But I think it just starts by talking to each other. It really starts by getting to know each other and breaking down the barriers. You know, like that man I met on the street, it can be as simple as just like getting to know the humanity of our neighbors and other people in our community. And then from there, learning how to work together to do things differently. And you know, that's sort of the personal beginnings. And there's organizations, there are so many organizations here in Cleveland. I've met a lot of you over the last few weeks. Doing this work. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You could get involved with an organization and just start to learn that way. learning through the institutions that you're involved with, your church or synagogue. You can work through that. Institutions, any other sort of institutions or agencies you already have personal involvement with can then become a bridge towards meeting people in other parts of the city and developing relationships that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned race-based segregation, and in the intro, and this is one of the most fire intros I've ever read, y'all, so if you don't do anything, read that today. But you note that slavery and Jim Crow were unique. Why was it important to name that, like, right from the outset?
Yeah, the part of the introduction of the book you're referring to, we try to warn against strategies that lump all people of color together. Sure, there are policies and practices that have discriminated against all, minority communities, but they act in different ways, and they have had different sort of motivations and different ways of working. And so if we want to not only stop those practices, but remedy their ongoing impacts, we have to be very specific about what we're remedying for. Mm-hmm. And if we try to apply remedies that are too broad, they risk not being politically feasible, first of all, to be able to prove what we're trying to solve for if it's too broad and we're not specific about the harms and the solutions, but they also won't be as effective, So we focus very explicitly on this book on the harms of public policy that created segregation and specifically targeted African American people and communities. And so our solutions should specifically target those same people and solutions. What we say is race-based crimes require race-based solutions. And in that section, we also acknowledge that, sure, other communities of color, other races and ethnicities have suffered discrimination at the hands of government, and they also deserve repair and remedy. But those strategies for remedy are different because the ways that discrimination has played out has been different. And that Jim Crow and slavery are unique and have had a different and longer lasting consequences than any other sort of racial discrimination we've seen in this country. And when we're talking about segregation, the segregation of African Americans and whites is persistent and has changed very little in many, many decades, while the segregation of other racial and ethnic groups changes over generations. And so, when we're looking at solutions, we have to be not only conscious of what we're solving for, but also what the sort of ongoing impacts are that we're trying to remedy and mitigate. Mm-hmm.
I know that folks are eager for the recommendations, but I wanted to do a little bit more grounding to make sure that we enter the recommendations sort of from the right altitude. And Dan mentioned it in his intro, and you also just mentioned it, this crime and the de facto versus de jure. Can you talk a little bit about that just to get us grounded?
Yeah, so we've adopted, accepted as a country, an explanation for why we are racially segregated as a country. And we tell ourselves that it's a form of de facto segregation. That means that it's a type of segregation that happens sort of by accident or by personal preference or private actions. So people say, and we've accepted as a country for a long time, that we're racially segregated because people just like to live around people who look like themselves. And so they self-sort into same race neighborhoods. Or it's a question of economics, that incomes sort of vary by race, and we live in neighborhoods based on our income or socioeconomic status, and that's why we're racially segregated. Or it was a result of private actors, landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers, who refused to sell or rent homes to African Americans and white communities. All of these explanations don't include a very important piece of the puzzle, which is the government, and the fact that these explanations don't actually explain how segregation happened in this country. It was created intentionally and explicitly by government policy, all levels of government, local, state, and federal. And those private actors, the role they played in creating segregation was required by these government policies. So whether they were bigoted or not almost doesn't matter, because the government at all levels was requiring them to act in a way that created segregated communities and maintain that segregation. And so the color of law took on that de facto segregation myth. And the whole book is filled with detailed examples of government policy that created segregation. The subtitle of The Color of Law is A Forgotten History of How Government Segregated America, because I think that's important to remember, because these actions of the government, when they were taken, were not hidden. They weren't a secret. They weren't enacted by, bad apples in government agencies. This was explicit government policy written into manuals, written into policy. And these policies were in violation of our Constitution. And so the government was breaking its own laws in creating these policies and discriminating by race. And so, once we reckon with that and understand that, we can see that we have an obligation to do something to remedy it. Mm-hmm. So that sort of covers the de facto segregation myth, and the truth is that it was really caused and continues to be maintained by government policies. And so there's a lot we can do. When we believe, as we did under the de facto segregation idea, that segregation happened by accident, it's this magical occurrence. If it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. And we have no role to play in doing anything about it or any obligation. And so once we reckon with this forgotten history and remember how it really happened, we can see that we have an obligation to do something about it and have a role to play and have agency, and there actually is something we can do, because it's not just this mystical occurrence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I promise recommendations after this question. You say in the book that you hope to provoke the imagination of activists and of the many more who would like to support them. Why was that important?
Yeah, well, so we wrote this book. We started writing it, I think, in late 2020, early 2021. So, and we wrote the book to answer that question: what do we do with this obligation we have to remedy segregation? How do we do that? But then in 2020, there was an outpouring of support for racial justice. There were 20 million people that marched in Black Lives Matter demonstrations after George Floyd's murder. And so we saw that there's a huge appetite in this country for racial justice. 20 million people, these were people of all races, from urban and suburban communities, from all regions of the country. And so we saw an opportunity to reach those people, because what we argue in Just Action is that to make the changes we envision are possible and necessary to redress segregation, we need a reinvigorated civil rights movement that can take on these issues locally. Now, to do that, we need a lot of people who might not think of themselves as activists to start taking action in their own communities. And so, we believe that there's an easy audience first of those 20 million people who turned out in demonstrations and then went home and put up lawn signs on their front lawns. And maybe they will never be activists, and so that's why we also refer to their supporters, because we need the movement that we imagine. It takes people who show up at city council meetings, who join and start campaigns to advocate for changes. And it also means people in our communities who might not take those actions but understand what the issues are, and so know what they're voting on when they vote on issues related to housing and segregation and elected officials, and what their platforms, what it means when they talk about these issues. And also what they can do to support advancing these changes in their own communities, whether or not they show up at a demonstration, because we need sort of supporters of all types to advance these ideas.
Mm-hmm. So we know the who is us. Can you talk to us about some of the recommendations? Just highlight
some of the how?
Yeah.
All right, so just to sort of frame it, we describe dozens of strategies that local groups can take on to begin to redress segregation in their communities. We focus on local strategies because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is it's hard to do anything on the federal government level right now. So if we start there, I think, you know, we're setting ourselves up for failure. Sure, and there, you know, there are things happening on the federal government when it comes to housing, but, you know, there's a lot more that we can do in our own local communities. We can build the political will to make these changes locally a lot easier than we can nationally right now. And you know, furthermore, even though the federal government played a major role in creating segregation, once that segregation is created, to a large extent, it's maintained and perpetuated by local policy. So there's a lot under local control that can be changed and challenged and enacted that will go a long way towards challenging segregation. So not only is it more feasible, but it actually will be more rewarding. It will have bigger impacts by focusing on local policies. So then the local policies and programs that we talk about, they do two things, and these two things are what I mean when I use the term redress, that it encompasses both ensuring that we don't continue to create and maintain segregation going forward. So they're forward-looking policies, but they're also past-looking policies. We have to address the disparities that already exist today as a result of government-sponsored segregation if we're truly going to challenge and remedy its impacts. You know, the Fair Housing Act, which was passed 56 years ago, looks to the future, which is great. You know, we can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing, but it doesn't address the past, the disparities that exist, the wealth gap that exists, the home ownership gap that exists, all as a result of past government policies. And so because the Fair Housing Act doesn't address that, here we are 56 years later, the home ownership gap between blacks and whites, the wealth gap is bigger, both gaps are bigger than they were in 1968. And so in order to really address these disparities, we have to do both things. And then the strategies, they fall into a few major categories. There are what are called place-based strategies, so those that are concerned with increasing investments in lower income, segregated African American communities, where the concentration of poverty, the sort of lack of access to resources in those communities are a direct result of the same policies that created their segregation. So to remedy the impacts of those policies, we want to increase access to resources in those areas. And then we also want to make sure that when that happens in these communities, we don't just see sort of rampant gentrification where when resources increase, higher income tenants, home buyers move in, drive up the prices, and the longtime residents of those areas are priced out of their own community just when resources are, you know, increased there. So these place-based strategies are coupled with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur. So some of examples of those kinds of strategies are starting community land trusts that create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities in places where housing prices are rising, protecting renters against evictions, unjust evictions, through passing just cause eviction ordinances or rent regulations. We write about Cleveland's Right to Counsel program as a model for the country. So supporting and expanding those programs that provide tenants with free representation when they're facing an eviction. Passing inclusionary zoning ordinances. These are all, again, locally based policies. Inclusionary zoning requires that when new housing is built in a community, a certain percentage of the units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices. So when communities start to see a lot of new development, this is a way to ensure that at least some of that new development can be accessible to the longtime residents of that community. Now we go a step further and say that those units, the affordable units created, should then have preferences or priorities on them to ensure that the longtime residents of those communities can access those units. And communities have done that. So that's the first category of strategies. The next category are what are called mobility strategies, and these are strategies for opening up exclusive expensive, predominantly white, often suburban communities to more diverse residents. So we need both of these angles to truly challenge segregation. So some strategies in this category include changing zoning. Most suburban communities require only allow one home per lot. And this single-family only zoning, I didn't know this until researching the book, but single-family only zoning is the major type of residential zoning in the country. And it came to prominence when racialized zoning was found to be unconstitutional. So it used to be that cities could zone their residential areas by race. And that's how they created and maintained segregation. The Supreme Court, somewhat surprisingly at some point, said, no, you can't do that. And so cities adopted single-family only zoning in those white neighborhoods to do the same thing, to keep those neighborhoods white by ensuring if you can only build one home per lot, the home prices stay high, because as demand increases, you can't build more homes to meet that demand. So if those communities stay expensive, only the most affluent families can live there, more likely white families, and that's how a main way that segregation has been maintained. So we need to challenge that type of zoning to allow more broader range of housing sizes and types and affordabilities, require affordable housing to be built in these suburban communities through zoning codes and zoning changes. We can also work on how the Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher Program is administered in our local communities. This is a rental subsidy that some low-income tenants receive. Disproportionately African American low-income families are, in the Section 8 population, and the program has the potential promise to provide the opportunity to these low-income families to leave high-poverty neighborhoods if they want, because the voucher, the benefit, is mobile. They can use it to rent anywhere in the private market. But there's several reasons why they can't. Discrimination is one. The federal government allows landlords to discriminate on the basis of how a tenant pays their rent. So if they use Section 8 to pay their rent, that's an allowed form of discrimination. Many cities and counties have passed source of income discrimination ordinances. There are, I think, about 20 in Ohio, 20 cities that have passed a source of income discrimination ordinance, but not yet Cleveland, and I don't know why. But that could happen here, to pass a local ordinance to protect Section 8 tenants from discrimination. And then there's several other local aspects of the Section 8 program that could be changed by the local public housing authorities to provide more opportunity for these tenants to live in higher cost areas if they want to. So those are a couple of the mobility examples. And then we also talk about strategies for increasing home ownership opportunities for African American families in any neighborhood, in all neighborhoods, reducing some of the obstacles that they face toward accessing home ownership, down payment assistance programs, for example, to address that racial wealth gap that exists because of past government policies. Addressing the credit scoring system and the ways that system has a disparate, discriminatory racial impact and blocks African Americans from accessing credit and mortgages. And I can get into details on any of these in the questions. I'm just trying to get through a lot. So giving you a broad sort of summary. And then there's a group of strategies that deal with, oftentimes, a lot of people in the housing field or people who are working on addressing the racial wealth gap and closing that gap think that home ownership is the way to do that. If we increase Black home ownership rates, the wealth gap will decrease. And to some extent, that's true, but it's not kind of the only answer, because there's a lot of ways that wealth building is limited for African Americans in home ownership in ways that it isn't for whites. And so we need to address those as well. Some of those ways are, the appraisal, a bias in the appraisal system. If there's racial bias in getting your house appraised, which is when an appraiser tells you how much your house is worth when you want to sell it or refinance it, if the appraiser is undervaluing your home, you can't build the same wealth you could if the appraiser was telling you that your home is worth what it really is worth. There's also disparities in the property tax system, where all over the country, homeowners in communities of color are overpaying in property taxes relative to the value of their homes compared to white homeowners in the same county. So if you're paying too much in property taxes, you might be a homeowner, but you can't build up the same wealth you could if you were paying your fair share in property taxes. So there's sort of, I say all of this not just to dump so much information on you that you can't sort of handle it, but my hope is that the kind of overwhelm in hearing how many things there are to do can be translated into hopefulness that there's so much that we can do. And any one of these strategies or policy changes will be hugely impactful to families and communities, and so we just need to start kind of chipping away.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to just take the opportunity to thank you. Your father's book changed a lot of people's lives, perspectives, including my own. I thought, like, there's nothing else that can be written that, and then it came out and I was like, whoa. And then this follow-on, I think really work of art from you all is incredible and reminds us, especially those of us that find ourselves feeling pretty down sometimes, that there is just so much action that we can take. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're about to begin the audience Q&A. For our live stream and radio audience, or those just joining, I'm Evelyn Burnett, co-founder and CEO of Third Space Action Lab, and moderator for today's conversation about how our communities can begin to undo segregation's damage. Joining me here today is Leah Rothstein, co-author of her latest book, Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. We welcome questions from everyone: City Club members, guests, students, and those joining via our live stream at cityclub.org or radio broadcast at 89.7 WKSU IdeaStream Public Media. If you'd like to text a question for our panelists, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And a City Club staff will try to work it into the program. May we have the first question, please?
Yes. Could you talk briefly about how the segregation has adversely affected immigrants and refugees of color, particularly?
Yeah, so many of the policies that created segregation and maintained it, redlining, discrimination in mortgage access and home selling, those same policies impact more newly arrived immigrant groups and other groups of color aside from African Americans, but affect them differently. So immigrant communities, Latinx communities, many who are newly arrived immigrants, they do live in ethnic enclaves, segregated communities, but these communities are a bit more freely chosen than segregated African American communities. These communities are places of slightly more opportunity. This is where newly arrived immigrants find networks for jobs and family support. And then often for these communities, a generation or two or three later, their children and grandchildren have left these ethnic enclaves and assimilated, integrated into other communities, oftentimes identifying as white in the census. So it's a very different sort of trajectory than segregated African American communities, where that generation after generation, it's just harder to leave those communities and develop the sort of networks and wealth building that you need to be able to access higher cost areas and leave and integrate into other areas. And the reasons for that are the government policies that we're talking about and their ongoing impacts. Like I mentioned briefly, credit scoring. So the credit scoring system we think of as racially neutral. It is in its design or it's in its intent, how it was designed. But the way it works is it takes your financial history and then gives you a credit score. If that score is high enough, you can access loans, car loans, mortgages. If it's not high enough, you can't get those kinds of loans. But it only factors in a certain type of financial history. And it's a type of financial history that whites are more likely to have than African Americans because of the neighborhoods that they live in. If you don't have access to a bank branch, you don't have access to traditional financial instruments, which is the only kind of financial history that feeds into a credit score. So if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a bank branch, which is more likely, African-American segregated neighborhoods have fewer bank branches because of the ongoing financial redlining of those communities. If you don't have access to those traditional financial instruments, you don't have the financial history to even have a credit score. So this is how the sort of ongoing impacts are accumulated over generations. You don't have a credit score, you can't get a loan. You can't get a loan, you can't get a credit score. And then you can't get a mortgage, you can't buy a house, you can't leave that neighborhood if you want to. So it has these sort of ongoing accumulation of impacts, these policies and programs, and it's slightly differently for different ethnic and racial groups, and that's why our solutions need to be slightly different.
In regards to your policy recommendations in gerrymandered states like Ohio, my name is Molly and I'm a community organizer. I've worked on grassroots campaigns to pass local renter protections here in Cuyahoga County, like pay to stay, trying to pass source of income discrimination protections, and then most recently a ballot initiative to give people more control of the local budget. And most particularly in that last effort, a lot of grassroots organizers and people doing more progressive policy work in municipalities in Ohio can't pass legislation without the threat of preemption. And although there's a current effort to ban gerrymandering in November, the Citizens Not Politicians Amendment, we know through other states like Wisconsin and Michigan that it takes multiple years to bear the fruit of those gerrymandered districts. So what's your call to action to local elected officials, nonprofits, and movement organizers who are trying to create local change on housing but face the barrier of preemption legally for local policy?
Great question.
It's a very good question.
Molly's really she's tough. She
Anyone
don't play
here have
around.
the
She don't play
answer?
around.
I mean, I don't have a perfect answer. It's difficult, and I think that this is true for everything I'm talking about. It's always difficult. Some communities face different challenges, maybe steeper hills to climb than others, but none of this is sort of easy to enact or easy to do, and it takes talking to people and building support in all parts of our cities. So, we have to make sure that the communities that more often oppose these kinds of changes get on board. We need a broader range of support in order to meet these obstacles and get through them. And I think your point about it being a multi-year, it takes a long time to see the impacts. I think that's true for a lot of what I'm talking about too. Like I speak to a lot of audiences about this, and I think I felt this way somewhat too before starting to do this particular work, is that there's a lot of sort of expectation. If it can't happen quickly, it's not worth doing. Right. If there's gonna be pushback or opposition, we shouldn't even try. And none of those sort of things have stopped past social justice organizers or activists, and we have to just push through all of that opposition and be patient and keep working on it. And yeah, that's the best answer I've got.
Thank you for coming to the City Club, and thank you for your rich and clear and needed voice. And at the City Club, as you probably know, we have a tradition of tough questions, and I'll give you two, and you can choose which one or both to ask for. So question number one is the R word, reparations, and is reparations a viable response to the history of de jure segregation that we've got? And here's number two. Given your and your family's rich history in organizing, what's your response to the current campus organizing and response? I mean, how do you put that in the context of the 60s and 70s that you grew up in?
Ooh,
Your choice, or both.
You should take both of those.
I'm going to start with number one. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that to be the easier question. So reparations. We don't use the term, intentionally don't use the term reparations in our book, Just Action, and there's a few reasons for that. One is, we're really working on building a broad umbrella of supporters, and want to use language that will include people in that umbrella who might not otherwise opt in. So we're very careful about the language we used. Another reason, now we do believe in repair, and we use the term remedies and repair and redress because they're slightly less charged words. And, in terms of reparations, I personally think the movement for reparations for slavery is important, and I'm excited to see sort of the momentum that's building. I do think the movement for repair and redress for the policies we're talking about are slightly different. Now, those policies, slavery was legal when it was in place. The policies we're talking about were illegal when they were enacted. They were unconstitutional, and so it requires slightly different remedies, and we have slightly more responsibility and obligation and legal justification for remedying those crimes. Those were, crimes when they occurred. And so, that's why we focus on that piece of the repair and reparations conversation. Now, I think since we wrote the book, even the term reparations and kind of the movement and conversation around it has expanded to include not just sort of monetary payments to repair slavery's injustices, but also the policy changes needed to repair the unconstitutional government actions that followed slavery. The expansion of the term, I think, has also come to, when we wrote the book, one of the risks of using the word reparations is you can pass a policy, Evanston passed a reparations policy that has to do with housing in Evanston, Illinois. There's a risk in calling a fairly small program like that a reparations program, because then you can say like, oh, well, we did it. We repaired that harm, we're done. And so we're trying to, make sure that we don't do that. These are a lot of the solutions we talk about are smaller pieces to the puzzle, and none of them are gonna repair completely the harm. And so we have to be expansive in our thinking around it.
Good morning. You've certainly given us a lot to chew on today, much. I, too, have a similar story, sort of like yours, but it goes into a little bit more detail. But my question to you is, I live in public housing, and I struggle with it as an activist and an advocate and a community leader every single moment of every single day. So how would you suggest a person would go about, because, see, all of this is psychological warfare, and all of this is spiritual warfare. We have not examined that. So when you bog down people of color with this type of thing, breaking them down, attacking their spirituality, and some of the first things that I often say, why should I get up and do something when the government is going to do what they want to do anyway? So how do you go about repairing a person's spiritual and psychologically to have them even step forward to even attack some of these issues that you talk about?
Well, I would love to hear maybe afterwards how you would answer that question. I would love to hear how to repair your spirituality.
My story is similar to yours. I got up and I hugged him. He smelled really bad. He was out in the grass until I said, I love him. All of a sudden, he stopped struggling and he started to cry. I said, not only do I love you, but somebody much more important than I love you. You work on a person like that. And it's probably the only time anybody ever said that they loved him. And that broke my heart. So that also broke his spirit.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, not to be a broken record, but I think all of this is about all of us actively engaging in these issues, actively together, people from all parts of our cities, all communities, saying that it matters what's happening in public housing in our city, saying that it matters what's happening in a neighborhood that looks differently from mine, And I care about it not because it's next door to me, but because it's part of my community, and I care about all of the people in my community. And I think that's how we start to repair some of the harm, by showing up for people who look differently from us, and being willing. I think a lot of the resistance to a lot of these ideas around racial equity and repair and housing equity, is people who are comfortable fear change, and they fear that they might become less comfortable. And I think we all have to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah. And also understand that life has changed, cities change, neighborhoods change. This idea that our neighborhoods can't change is one of the very harmful ideas that have come out of planning and zoning, that my neighborhood should always look like this, and it should never change, and it's my birthright to live in a neighborhood that always looks like this, when really neighborhoods should be dynamic, and we should all learn to accept that reality. And my hope, my sort of vision is, once we start spreading that understanding and living according to that understanding, some of this sort of feeling that nobody cares about other people will start to shift. That's my hope. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nick. I'm with NV5. Question. So I'm no idiot. I just bought a house. I'm getting all these letters to refi the house. Before that, when my credit score was between 580 and 670, I was getting all this quick money mail. And I fell prey to this really early in my life. It took me a long time to bounce back and get a house. And I'm reading these new refinancing letters, and they're very attractive in this language that they're using. The fine print is very hidden. And I know for a fact the 2008 housing bubble hit people hard in the Huff areas. People that had homes for decades, even a century, in their families lost them. People have not bounced back. And I read the book, Some of Us by Heather McGhee, and she talks about how the finance sector controls a lot of Congress and still has not paid for the wrongs of that rapacious lending system. How do we go after them? How do we teach our kids to resist this predatory lending and to focus on the basics of finance?
Great question.
Well, we can go after them by organizing in our communities and pressuring our local banks. We do write about, in Just Action, using the Community Reinvestment Act to pressure banks to live up to their obligations to invest in all areas of their service area, not just in the richer, whiter areas. That doesn't directly address their sort of crimes in the subprime mortgage scandal. That's kind of a larger, harder to access as local residents. But their local residents do have great success in organizing using the Community Reinvestment Act. So the Community Reinvestment Act was enacted in '76, I think, in the 1970s, in response to redlining, to try to get banks to reverse their redlining practices by requiring them to invest in the lower and moderate income neighborhoods in their larger service area. They get a score on how well they do that. Unfortunately, most of them get good scores, whether or not they're actually doing well at it. And so that's where community involvement comes in, because the scores, the assessments that banks get are all public information. And when banks want to acquire or buy another bank, which happens a lot more often than you would ever imagine, when they want to merge or acquire another bank, they have to get federal regulatory approval, and those federal regulators look at the CRA scores, and they have to take public input. And so community groups organize efforts to create campaigns, to publicize these banks' poor performance in the subprime lending crisis, or in current day, how they're lending in our communities. Banks really don't like negative public information out there. They like to be seen as upstanding members of the community. So using that information can help pressure banks to come to the table to negotiate with community groups. And many of them do this. They then negotiate community benefits agreements where the community groups can get commitments around mortgage lending in their communities, small business lending, investments in affordable housing, investments in economic development. And in exchange for these commitments, the community groups agreed to support their merger acquisition application. And that's how communities can use the levers that they have under the Community Reinvestment Act to help banks to improve their performance. And there's groups doing this all over the country. There's a national organization, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, that helps local groups organize these campaigns and find out when banks are merging. So there's resources out there for helping communities figure out how to do that.
Hi, my name's Arthur. I'm a retired pediatrician, and I want to thank you for you and your father. You've borne witness so that each of us now know that these cruelties only exist by our choice, and we can change them. So thank you. I want to give a shout out to the St. Luke's Foundation, Cleveland Foundation, for bringing Purpose-Built Community Project to Cleveland. If you drive by Woodhill Estates, you'll see community transformation in process. And my question is, community-led that is. They brought this program that allows community residents to lead this transformation. But my question is, have you seen a community desegregate, A, and B, has that had an impact on one of the cruelest de facto realities of segregation, which is the disparity in infant mortality? In Cleveland, there are neighborhoods where a baby who's born deemed of color is 7 times more likely not to survive to the first birthday than a baby born deemed white. And we know that is by choice because that disparity doesn't exist in the U.S. Army. So we know it's by choice. And the question is, are there neighborhoods that have desegregated where you've seen infant mortality disparities go away?
Great question. I don't know the details of the infant mortality rates, but you're correct that the neighborhoods we live in determine our health outcomes. Children who grow up in segregated African American communities have higher rates of asthma. They grow up to have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and shorter life expectancies. A neighborhood a mile away from another neighborhood could have a life expectancy 10, 15, 20 years shorter. And that is, like you said, by choice, not the individual's choice, but the choice of us as a society, where we decided that this neighborhood could be right next to a freeway with diesel trucks and could be right next to a factory. And the children there could live in houses with lead paint. So all of the sort of access to pollution and stress and lack of access to open air, trees, green space, all of that determines our health outcomes. Now, in terms of integrating a community and changing health outcomes, I think integrated communities do have better health outcomes, because when a community is integrated, the sad truth of our country is if a community is racially integrated, it's harder to subjugate it the same way and to depress the resources in that community in the same way and to put factories right next to it in the same way. And so that's part of why racial integration improves everybody's outcomes. So I don't have the specific data on that. I'm sure it exists out there, but living in integrated communities tends to be healthier communities. Yes.
Leah Rothstein, Evelyn Burnett. Thank you so much. I feel like we've been waiting a couple of years for this conversation, so we really appreciate this and the book as well. Forums like this are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like all of you who are here with us today, watching on our live stream and listening on WKSU. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech at cityclub.org. Today's forum is part of the City Club's Health Equity Series, presented in partnership with the St. Luke's Foundation. It's also part of our Authors in Conversation series, which is presented thanks to support from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture and the Cuyahoga County Public Library. Thank you so much to all of these organizations for your support of civil civic dialogue here at the City Club. We'd like to extend a special welcome to students who are joining us from MC Squared STEM High School. Hey guys. Also, in addition to those tables hosted by our sponsors, we'd also like to welcome guests at tables hosted by the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, Bike Cleveland, Birthing Beautiful Communities, the Cleveland Foundation, and Global Cleveland, who has a special group of leaders from across Southeast Asia with us today. Thank you so much for being a part of our forum today. Thanks also to Third Space Action Lab and Third Space Bookstore for reading room. Thank you, reading room, for selling books today. Up next at the City Club on Friday, May 17th, Jody Ruderin, who is the editor-in-chief of The Forward and the former New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem, will join us in conversation with Andy Geronimo. He's director of the First Amendment Clinic at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. They'll talk about the importance of independent media in an age characterized by polarization. But if there's one thing about which there is no polarization, it's the brilliance of 8-time Grammy winner Terrence Blanchard, who will be joining us on the 21st. He is a trumpeter, a pianist, and he got his start composing while working on film scores with Spike Lee. Yeah, I know. So he's going to be, he'll be here as part of his participation in the Cleveland Orchestra's Mandel Humanities Festival. It's May 21st, as I said. And former BET producer Jeff Johnson will moderate that conversation. Tickets about all these events and more at cityclub.org. That brings us to the end of our forum, friends. Thank you so much for being with us today. Have a wonderful weekend, and go Cavs.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.